Welcome to From Stuck to Scaled, Growth Strategies for Small and Mid-Sized Businesses, your guide to navigating growth, transformation, and success in today's ever-changing business landscape. Each week, we'll dive into proven strategies, real-world case studies, and actionable insights designed to help small and mid-sized business owners scale smart, lead stronger, and grow faster. Let's get you unstuck and on the path to sustainable, scalable success. Now your host, Julio Gonzalez.
Welcome back to From Stuck to Scaled, Growth Strategies for Small and Mid-Sized Businesses. I'm your host, Julio Gonzalez, and every week we explore practical strategies, leadership insights, and real-world tools to help small and mid-sized businesses break through barriers and grow with confidence. Have you ever had one of your best employees leave? I'll bet it was for money. At least you think it is. Today we're talking about how employees leave managers, not companies. And it's usually not about the money. Today's guest is going to help us understand this dynamic and what to do about it. Joining us today is Diana Valenzuela-Hidalgo, a powerhouse HR strategist and founder of DVHR Solutions, known for helping companies turn people into profit. Diana is an HR leader with over 20 years of experience helping multicultural organizations align people strategy with business growth. As founder of DVHR Solutions, she partners with companies to improve performance, retention, and culture through strategic HR consulting. Diana has led HR for Fortune 500 companies across industries like logistics, retail, and media. She holds a master's in HR management, a PHR certification, and is McKinsey Leadership Accelerator graduate. Her mission: to turn people into a company's most profitable asset. And joining us now is Diana Valenzuela.
Yay.
So, Diana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Julio. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
All right. Well, again, my name is Diana Valenzuela. I worked 25 years in human resources. I worked for Fortune 500 companies, and I'm very passionate about HR. About 3.5 years ago, I started my own consulting company because I realized that we can impact small businesses. So I focus now on helping small and medium businesses grow with the HR strategy. And my focus is connecting people with profit because we know a business without a profit is not a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And you and I met at a networking event that we go to, and we've had some pretty in-depth conversations because our businesses are very closely aligned. And I love the topic that you proposed because I am very much a believer that most of the time employees don't leave for money, but they leave because of the manager. So talk to us and the company, obviously. So talk to a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, it was great meeting you, and I'm very honored to be here with you, Julio. But yeah, from my 20 something years of experience working at Fortune 500 companies, I started seeing different reasons why employees leave organizations. But there was a pattern, right? And the pattern was pretty much leadership and toxic work environments, right? When I did the exit interviews in those companies, employees felt overlooked, undervalued, and under challenged, and often unsupported by their leader. So it's not surprise that, I mean, at that point when you're exiting an employee and they're leaving, it's already too late to ask those questions.
Right.
The idea is to be proactive and have a different strategy to be able to prevent that happening. But in today's market, we know that the ability to keep top talent, it is a competitive advantage to any business, right?
So what should companies do?
Mhm.
Before you get to that point, because obviously that starts, long time ago. So
Yeah.
how do we address that?
Yeah, before I get into that, I'm going to give you other reasons too, because oftentimes we hear that employees leave organizations because of compensation. And that could be a reason, but there are other hidden forces within the reason of why employees leave organizations. And we know that's very impactful to the bottom line. Lack of career growth is another one, right? So We know that top performers, they really crave development. And we're not only talking about linear career growth, but horizontal too,
Right.
because they're looking for experiences, they're looking to really learn new skills. So to be able to create a individualized career path, I think it's going to be key to retain top employees. We talked about the main one that I've seen across the board, which is the poor leadership and toxic work environment. And that speaks to lack of transparency, lack of communication, and lack of empathy, right? Nowadays, we see a lot of leaders that are very what I call transactional, where they're not building and connecting. They're
Right.
just basically going through the motion of getting the job done and not really understanding the perspective of the employee and not able to create a connection between a personal aspiration with the company's goals. And that is the secret sauce for success and retention. Yeah.
And when you say connection, go into that a little bit more because
Yeah.
I'm thinking connection at a number of different levels.
Yeah. So we're humans and we like to connect. And I always say connect with your people on a personal level first. Understand who they are as individuals, right? Understand their family, what they do outside, out of work, because we all bring ourselves to work. So connecting is really getting to know your employees, their strengths, their opportunities, what they're struggling with. So you understand the context behind why an employee may come late one day, right? Because maybe they're having an issue with daycare or they're going through divorce and they're going through a battle at home, right? So when you build that connection, you can not only understand what's the context behind, but you can go deeper into coaching because you already built that relationship with the employee. And another reason why employees leave organizations is because of burned out and work-life imbalance. So unsustainable paces, intense workload pressures. We need to be able to catch that earlier, not late, because we know that there's context outside of work, right? And if your employee is late or is coming late, you now know and understand why that's happening. So we need to be able to be aware of that and catch it early, not only at the exit interview process.
Diana, I hear a lot about the lack of loyalty from employers, but that loyalty is everything that you've just described. Uh,
Hmm.
it used to be that you would get a job and you were in that job for 30, 40 years and retire, and you were there your whole life and you came out with a pension.
Hmm.
Um, how how can companies not go back to that, because I don't know that we're ever going to go back to companies giving pensions in that way, but how can we care for that whole individual in a way that is still financially viable to the organization, basically addressing the things that you've just listed?
That's a great question, Julio. And I think we need to understand generations and the generations that are coming to the workforce, right? I'm a Gen X, very different from baby boomers. We had the Gen Zs, and pretty soon in 2028, we're going to have Generation Alpha.
Hmm.
Generation Alpha are the kids of the millenniums, right? And they're gonna want something completely different in terms of benefits. They might not even care about benefits because they are hyper digital. And when it comes to training and development, they just don't want to be in a classroom with everyone else
Right.
learning a cookie cutter approach about a specific topic. So I think we need to personalize benefits too. And it sounds like, oh my God, how do we do that? There's a way to do that. And understanding that based on the generation, there's different needs and wants, and our workforce is full of all four, five to be generations, and everybody wants something different. So, how do we level set that in understanding what the communication style is, understanding the needs and wants, and coming up with something that is going to really benefit all generations, right? But providing that customization of training and development, because that's going to be key for the new generation coming to the workforce.
Yeah, I had an episode, a couple of, I think it was episode number two, with
Mm-hmm.
Alexis Bolaños, who is part of my Leadership Hollywood
Mm-hmm.
group, and it was precisely leadership and Gen X or Gen and the millennials, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about the differences between Gen Xers and her generation, and they're looking for a lot more independence, but not necessarily from a management perspective, but
Mm-hmm.
from how they do their job.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think we saw during COVID.
Yes.
Because now you have people at home, and the existing managers didn't know how to handle that because we've
Mm-hmm.
never really trained for that. So there's this whole series of things coming together,
Mm-hmm.
um, that we're now blaming, oh, the millennials don't know how to work. Well, is it that they don't know how to work, or is it that we, the Gen Xers and others, don't know how to manage?
Right.
So how do you approach that with your customers?
Well, you brought me back to this one scenario with one of my clients where he was reluctant to allow an employee to work from home because he thought they were not going to be doing anything and he needed to be in the office. The employee needed to be in the office near him. He needed to see him every day. And I think it's perception. And that, to be honest with you, that's an old school mentality because
Completely.
at the end of the day, we manage by results. And it is the manager's responsibility to put KPIs, metrics, to have one-on-ones. And I created an acronym for those one-on-ones. I call them IFMs, individual focus meetings,
Okay, I like that.
because yeah, because the one-on-ones can be sometimes transactional. Like, okay, tell me what you're working on, and when I have an individual focus meeting, I'm going to be focusing on your growth. Yes, I'm going to go through did you do it, yes or no, and why? But we're going to have career conversations. In that one sheet of one on one, I'm going to have your goals for the year. I already know your style. I already know the things you like and the way you want me to communicate with you. So that's going to give me a lot of context on the conversation. And even if it's a conversation that is based on performance, I'm going to have that data to be able to be intentional. And I'm going to build that trust. So I think we need to evolve and understand that we're losing a lot of people, especially now that some of the companies decided to bring people on site. I do understand that on-site brings a synergy, that there are times for like
Completely.
sales teams, for instance. I love when the sales teams come together and they have the huddles and that energy. That's amazing. But asking yourself as an employer, where do I build that flexibility? If it's not because you're a salesperson and you need to be here 3, can I give you 1 day? Can we negotiate something? Understanding the context behind that person. And we went back to the beginning, connecting and understanding what that human needs is going to help you retain, and you'll see that they will give you 150% because you're creating a win-win between what the employee wants and what the business needs to achieve its goals.
What was your acronym again for the one-on-ones?
IFMs.
IFM. So in the IFMs, do you coach your leadership clients to the IFM being a two-way conversation?
Yes, exactly. A
Yeah,
two-way conversation, and having that guide will help really to be, but you can only go to that process when you build that really good relationship and connection, because if you
completely.
really never talk to him and you can come up with the excuse that it's because my employee is not on site, you still can connect, you still can be intentional. All right. Because once you do that, you have the IFM, and it's really just about that person. It's really about their growth, their hurdles, their obstacles. And your job is to remove them and to give that feedback right there in that moment, that candid feedback, and asking for permission to grow them. Right. I always tell my leaders, always drive the intention of the meeting at the beginning of the conversation. Is this meeting about giving you some constructive feedback? Is this meeting just to talk about a particular project? Is this meeting is to talk about your career aspirations? And you should always, you can even intertwine some of those things together. Like I always talk about career aspirations and what's going on in their life because that impacts performance. So I always want to know how you're doing, how's your family, how's everything going on your side, because that would help me also understand if there are any red flags or something that as a leader I need to tackle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
And the leader, there's so many bad, in big quotes, right,
Hmm.
leaders. They're
Yes,
not, they're just managers.
managers, right?
um, I had one that I would, we had weekly one-on-ones, and I literally had about 3.5 minutes of his attention.
Hmm.
After that, he would start yawning and, like, trying to control the yawn, so you can tell that he was just, uncomfortable, and say, okay, lost him. And at that point, I'd find a way to just, cut the conversation.
Yeah.
The leader has to be astute enough and have
Hmm.
the EQ, to really,
Yes.
be active in that conversation, in listening to that employee. It cannot just be, a one-way conversation. And I want to make sure that our listeners, hear that, because so many think that, a one-on-one is, give me your status and I'm going to tell you that you're doing a good or a bad job. That's not enough. You have to connect,
Yes.
in both directions, with that employee.
And part of that, Julio, I think as we've seen with some of the organizations, we are missing the mark when it comes to training and development leaders because they are the reason for employee engagement. And there was that old saying, people don't leave my organizations, they leave their leaders.
Yep.
So we spent millions of dollars on, and because you were in IT, right, training leaders and the
Hmm.
technical part of the
Right.
job, and but how about those soft skills of really connecting, of building relationships with your direct reports, of managing conflict, of managing emotional, right, outbursts, or things that happen on a day to day when your employee is upset, frustrated, and he's having one of those moments? How do you manage that, right? We need to build for those competencies and for that model. So it's easier for the leaders to have these conversations because it's not always obvious and depends on the leader's personality. It could be hard for someone to really connect at that level.
Yep. Absolutely. And, you know, in my experience, companies have stopped doing training almost altogether.
Hmm.
And they'll do, I'll call it spot training,
Hmm.
where they see finally that there's a problem, and, we're going to go through this special 6-month effort, and, they might bring some trainers in and do some training, and then it's done. And training has to be an ongoing
Hmm.
initiative, and it doesn't have to be complex, but you have to have something in place, to continue that growth and learning for everyone at every level.
Correct. The continuous training, very intentional. And I always think that one of the things that we need to do better as organizations is to allow for the execution and implementation of the training. We did a study at my previous company, and we spent thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars on training, and we didn't see the return on investment. Why? Right? So it was like sending someone 5 days to take this training, and they came back, and 2 days later, nothing changed. Right? So it is a responsibility to build that implementation, whether it's a project, how do we, and immediately, because we know that there's a time when you kind of lose that momentum and the learning is gone. So I think that is also one of the major responsibilities of a leader, especially if we're sending someone to be trained. What's the value of that in the return on investment? What is he or she able to bring back that we can implement in our department so we can get this process better, this whatever it is the training about, but allowing that to happen in real time is going to be incredibly important.
Now you're bridging, training into one of my favorite areas, and that's change management.
Mm,
I'm a certified, I forget what the acronym is, certified change management practitioner.
wow.
Um, and change management is hard.
Mhm.
And to your point on the training, yes, you send somebody off, for a week, or you bring in people, whatever, method you want to follow, but then it transitions into a change management exercise. So how do you manage that ongoing evolution, that was brought in through that training? and
Hmm.
companies don't understand change management at all. Tomorrow we're going to start, instead of ABC, we're going to do 1 2 3, poof. And magically it's supposed to, happen and stick. But most companies
Hmm.
don't go into, a change management effort to make
Hmm.
sure that everyone buys in and that everyone understands, and can really instill substantive change. So talk to me a little bit about that post training, implementation and adherence,
Yeah.
utilizing change management.
That's a great point, Julio. And I think part of that is we've seen a lot of organizations who have a lot of that compliance training, and it's very transactional. We are
Yes.
going through a compliance and almost like check the box. We need to go to D&I training. Everybody needs to be trained on that. Yeah, it is compliance. We got to do it, but we got to get out of that mandatory training, right? I think we need to get excited about the opportunity for learning, and it needs to start on the top. Our top leaders need to really convey that message and deliver that message. It's not only the leader, but it comes from the top. When the leader can share, right, their views and beliefs and training and how, a success story that helped them not only acquire maybe a new job, but acquire new skills, able to have ammunition or evidence of, of things that they want to learn. I think if we have that coming from the top, is really going to set the tone for a continuous learning process. And then when you get to that leader departmental area, you want to make sure that as soon as the employee comes back from that training, you have that one-on-one. And that one-on-one is going to be all about that training, all about the 5 3 or 2 days that you spent. Walk me through the lessons, walk me through some of the things and comparing and contrasting, right? Let's say you go for a training on change management or whatever it is, right? You coming back with specific ideas of what can we do different, and from there convert it into a project. So sometimes leaders are afraid of doing that because it's like, my employee is already overwhelmed, now he's coming from a training and I'm going to give him more work. Well, guess what, it is your job to be creative and think about, before he comes back from that training, what in his day to day I can really align that training to, so we can create a win win for the business and for the employee. You're able to use the skills and what you learn in that training, and we're able to really obtain maybe creativity, innovation, or a new process altogether that is going to help us do X, Y, and Z. But you have to be very intentional and you have to create something that is really going to move the needle, not just to create another project. It's not like a pilot, it's a real project that you can really connect, so you can create that win-win between what was learned and what the business needs, so you can reinforce that and then you congratulate, right? So it's not only you went through the training, you implemented, but you recognize the efforts. And now, guess what? Everybody's adopting a new methodology, a new system, a new way of thinking, just because that person, came back with a fresh perspective of implementing something new that we're able to execute real time.
And let's elevate that conversation a little bit higher and bring that to the broader corporate culture.
Mm.
Now, how does corporate culture fit into this evolution almost of the organization?
That's a great question, Julio. I think depends on the organization, and every single organization is going through a different phase, right? Some organizations are growing very rapidly. Other organizations might be restructuring, so they're not really thinking about growth and development because they're restructuring. They might not be thinking about, I'm going to send my employee to for training, because that's not what they're focused. So we need to first understand what state is the organization going through, because if an organization is cutting and is reducing, the training might not be the most important thing at this moment, right? Our efforts might be concentrated on really taking care of our employees and providing the severance and right? But if an organization is expanding and is growing, and they want to keep their employees, we want to ensure that our corporate leaders and corporate culture, supports that. And the first thing is the budget for training, because we know that the first thing that goes out the window, it's the financials, right? When there's cuts and business is not doing well one particular month or two or three a quarter, the first thing that sometimes come to the table are, what do we cut? What do we cut? And training and development goes out the window, right? Oh, that's the easiest thing to cut. We were budgeted. Never forget conversation that I had with a direct report, and we had allotted for, I think it was $1,000 or $2,000 on a yearly basis, so they can go in and get certified in HR. And for them, that was huge because it's outside of what we do, but you have this budget for you, so you can go in and get trained and whatever you want to do, and that it ties back to the business. And unfortunately, that was cut, completely cut. Um, Julio, I took it out of myself to send the employee, and I pay that out of my own pocket. Of course, I try to get that reimbursed, and that didn't
Right.
happen, and that was fine because I had promised her that she was going to go through that training, and here I am talking to her about, oh yeah, sorry, cancel that, cancel your dream to be certified because we had a backwater. So I think really prioritize learning and really not eliminating that, even if we have a bad period. Unfortunately, I've seen that happening many, many times.
And it's part of the business cycle to have better periods and worse periods, but a lot of times the company will cut off training like you're saying and not provide any kind of future for that.
Mhm.
So I think it's very important
Mhm.
to effectively communicate with the staff and say, look, we're having a rough time right now, and
Mhm.
we're going to have to postpone
Mhm.
training. But as soon as we're able to bring that back on, we're going to do that.
Mhm.
Giving the employees some hope
Right.
that we're not just forgetting about this altogether. We're just putting it aside for a bit. That even that little extra, I think, goes a long way to reassure the employee
Yeah.
that the company's still looking out for them.
And there's so many different options of things that you could do. If you're going to have that message, I think you want to be intentional and have different options. I mean, I created mentoring programs. I worked for a company who had different offices in different parts of the US. So we had mentoring processes, programs across different cities. We created a data live in another department, right? That is all part of training. And that was a great program because I'm in HR. I really want to learn finance. So I was partnered with a chief financial officer to be with him for a day to experience a data live of his day. And I learned a lot. So that's another type of training that, yeah, it's not going to be a formal classroom training, but it's going to give you new skills and new understanding for a completely different department. And that's all skills that an employee is gaining. That's also part of training. So I think there's a lot of things. If that were to happen, we just have to be creative, intentional, and come up with organically something that we can do as an organization that will still be considered training, that is going to help employees acquire different skills.
And that's a fantastic point because not all training is classroom training.
Mhm.
That you can absolutely have an employee step into another role, at least from a shadowing perspective,
Yes.
to learn other aspects of the business. I've had employees that were developers and they wanted to eventually move into the business and go spend a week with whatever operations department,
Yes.
and maybe it's not a week, maybe it's a couple of hours a week, on an ongoing basis. But that's thinking creatively
Mhm.
about what you can do for the employees. And a lot of companies don't have that creativity.
Yeah, and actually, that's a great example of a really good strategic onboarding. And I never forget when I worked at this company at the airport. It was hospitality, and I worked in HR, and the general manager tells me, "You're going to be the expediter in the kitchen." A restaurant in Miami, and I'm like, "Expediter, what is that?" So he sent not just me, everyone. He chose a day, and I remember Jose Cuervo was the name of the restaurant. I don't know if they have it there on Miami Airport, Mexican restaurant. And I was the expediter, and I had so much fun working in the kitchen. It gave me a new perspective about the roles because I was the one who was recruiting for cooks and right
Right.
those roles, and now I understood what an expediter was. I was in the kitchen helping expediting the food because it was a pretty hectic restaurant. So that also serves as a great onboarding because when there is a complaint and I don't understand what you do, well, now you do, you were in my shoes. Now I had so much grace and understanding for that business that when I went back to my desk the next morning and I read the job description, it really made sense to me because I did that job for a day. So if you're able to connect it to a department that usually work together and maybe they're having some sort of friction, having that interchangeable duties and responsibilities not only helps for training purposes but also mentoring and understanding each other's departments, and that also helps with conflict resolution, right, and empathy as well.
Absolutely, and I had a similar experience in a recent role. The CEO told me, I want you to go follow the bouncing ball. The old kids videos that had the ball on the words. Start where the customer starts and follow the entire process all the way through. To shipping and payment and everything. And that allowed me to very, very quickly come up to speed on the entire operation of the organization, and that helped me tremendously. And people would tell me, wow, how did you learn this so quickly? Well, I followed the process and asked questions. And that's something that I recommend a lot to
Yeah.
individuals when they start new roles.
No, that makes a leader very powerful. When I've done that job and I know how long does it take, what are the obstacles that you're facing and the challenges. Because as a leader, that is my number one priority is to be able to grow other leaders, remove any obstacles or roadblocks, and really maximize employees' potential. And the only way to do that is to really get into their day to day. And that's a great way of doing that. So good for you, Julio.
Diana, one of the last things, or the last thing I want to touch on, and it's a conversation that you and I had, is about promotions in organizations.
Mm,
People promoted because you have to do something with them.
mhm.
And a lot of times they just aren't ready. How do you tell your leaders to handle promotions, and what do you recommend for the employee that's looking for promotion?
Yeah, it's a great question. So oftentimes we see a lot of promotions, like you said, taking place without really giving it the thought of the readiness factor and the need for the business. On the other side, we want to sometimes retain employees and we throw them into jobs because we're afraid that they're going to leave. So I'm going to promote you to this role, but we're
Right.
not ready. They're not ready. We're not ready because we don't really have clarity. They did a study, I think it was Harvard University, on the two most important competencies that employees really appreciate. One is clarity, and the second one is psychological safety, right? So you're going to promote me into a role that you're not even 100% clear. We're not clear on expectations. So you almost like setting me up for failure, right? I think employees need to graduate from the current role, right? They need to exceed expectations. I always ask the leaders when they used to come to my office when I worked at corporate and said, hey, I'm ready to promote. And I remember there was a little form, but I made it very conversational. Like, okay, walk me through that employee's path. And I know the employee, but tell me the latest achievements and what are they struggling with. And when I heard things like, well, yeah, they're performing, but they're great, and they've been here 20 years, and I'm afraid that they're gonna leave. So I want to be able to. I said, time out. We're not ready for that. Why don't we create an individual development plan for that employee that will consist of maybe a performance improvement plan or career development conversation, but we're not ready to do that. Let's map that out. Might not happen now, but it could happen in the future if we're very intentional and really coaching that employee. So I always recommend to, before you promote, ask the question, is that employee exceeding expectations? They graduated from the job, they're ready, they're already acting as if they already had that other role. You know, because that employee is a leader by nature.
Absolutely.
They're just already taking the lead. They already want more. They're the ones who are raising their hand. What else can I do? When those signs come into the picture, you know that they're ready. Now you really have to think about the role, right? Based on their skills, their aspirations, and hopefully you had those IFMs, individual focus meetings, to know what do they value, right? What is the type of role? Do we have that in the organization? Is that something that I need to create? Because I don't also recommend creating roles for the sake of creating roles.
Right.
But if there is a business need and I can match that to the employee's aspirations, bingo, you hit the jackpot, because wow, that's where retention really happens, because that employee is going to feel valued, appreciated, and they're going to grow with the company. So I recommend really just being very intentional, working with the HR person or an HR consultant to build those plans, because it's not easy to do from that perspective of the time that it takes. But we can guide our leaders on how to have those conversations and how to create those plans. And if someone is not ready, also, how do you have that conversation? You're not ready, and you're not ready because, and here is the plan, right? It's not just you're not ready, because that's going to demoralize, and that's one of the reasons why employees leave, as we started talking at the beginning of the podcast, right? If a manager goes in and tells you, Julio, you're not ready for this role. You applied 3 times, you're not ready. You're gonna walk out and you say, you know what, I'm overlooked. I'm gonna go elsewhere. But the conversation needs to be very different. Here is the reason why you're not ready yet. The word "yet" is the key word there. Yet. And here's a plan.
I want to call out a word that you've said at least 5 times, and that's intentional. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that I use intentional in a very different, using different words. You'll hear me talk a lot about making decisions with eyes wide open.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing what you're getting into, not just making a decision for the sake of the decision, but the why. And you've used intentional a number of times, and I think that's so important for
Mm-hmm.
people to hear, because you have to, make the decision with a purpose, with intention, and not just because. And I think that's something that a lot of leaders and companies, fail at.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you guide your leaders on, leading with intent?
Absolutely. Leading with intent and purpose, right? So every time there's a tough conversation or a decision that needs to be made, we need to slow down to speed up. I always say slow down so we can speed up. And oftentimes we'll do the opposite. Speed up, make a decision, and then we have to slow down because we realize,
Right.
oh, I put the wrong person in there. Oh, I make this decision and it's the wrong decision. So we go back, and I always gather a few leaders. If the decision is a global decision that is going to impact the organization, we need to have the stakeholders in the room. If it's an HR decision, the same thing. If it's an employee decision, you want to talk to the employee and make them part of that decision process if they're able to, right? If you're changing the employee's job, for instance, completely, ask the question, is this something that you would want to continue to do? Don't assume that you're changing from this role to another role that requires different skills, and you're just going to put the employee without going through that process of being intentional, asking their questions and validating that as something that they still want to do. And nothing happens if they say no, it's not aligned. At least you know, right? So I think it's key to be intentional and to have purpose behind every conversation, and going into the meetings ready with tools and frameworks that are going to help drive really engagement, because at the end of the day, it's really about improving engagement.
Absolutely. I'm
Mhm.
sure there's plenty of related books out there, but I see a book in your future.
Oh,
Intentional leadership.
yeah. How did you know that's coming?
Hey, I want credit for the title. I'll write the foreword for you.
Yes, yes, yes. That's great.
So,
Yeah.
Diana, no one comes on the podcast without providing some actionable tips that our
Mhm.
listeners can put into place today to help their business. So, what do you have for our listeners?
Yes. So the first one is to start conducting state interviews. Exit interviews are great, but they're not proactive. If you're asking the questions about what can we do better, what happened during the exit interview, is already too late. Yeah, it is valuable data, but 90% of the time you gather that data, nothing really happens. We need to really start conducting those state interviews and ask those questions. What would make you stay in this company? If you consider taking another job, what would be a reason why you attempt to do so,
Right.
right? And what could make this job the best job in your career? Those just three questions are powerful, and it could help you understand if you see a red flag, especially with high performers, right? With the top talent. We call them high potentials. You want to be able to have this type of interview, state interviews often. Mhm. The tip number two, we talked about it, is to train your managers on the culture, right? And give them the accountability and responsibility for employee retention, right? And ensure that they understand that they're number one driver on employee retention. Yeah, there are other things that come into the picture like benefits and but the leader has a major part. So we need to train for that, right? On how to have these conversations we talked about, whether it's a development conversation, a coaching, a performance conversation, and oftentimes we don't have the time to provide that training. So I would say that's number two. And number three, audit your employee experience. Right. So we describe employee experience to be the interaction that we have with employees from the very, very beginning of their interactions. Sorry,
The onboarding.
yeah, of the conversation with us, from how we attract the employee, how do we go through a process of interviewing, how do we onboard them, how do we develop them, how do we coach them, how do we even terminate them if we need to, right? So, what is that all experience entails? So, we need to audit that and ensure that our values in the organization are tied to every single of the life process of that cycle.
Those are great. And how can our listeners find you?
Yes. Well, you can find me on Instagram. I'm in LinkedIn as well as DVHR Solutions. Stands for Diana Valenzuela. And my Instagram is DVHR Solutions. You can find me there as well.
Awesome. Fantastic. Losing great people doesn't always come down to paychecks or perks. It's about how your team feels day to day. If today's episode opened your eyes to some of the hidden reasons top talent walks, don't just listen, act. Start with one of Diana's tips. Hold a stay interview this week, coach your managers on culture, or audit the first 90 days of your employees' experience. Small shifts lead to big retention wins. A huge thank you again to Diana for sharing her insights and helping us see beyond the surface. If this helped you, share with a leader who you think needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time on From Stuck to Scaled.
You've been listening to From Stuck to Scaled, growth strategies for small and mid-sized businesses, produced by Optocution LLC. For more information, tools, and resources, check out our website www.redefinepossible.co/podcast.